Hello everyone, I'm Rory Kelly. On behalf of Sam Cumming, Gabe Greenberg, and myself, thanks for attending, as it were, our presentation, Structures of Allegiance and Morality. What we intend to demonstrate today is that the moral hierarchy of a story can differ from the order of our allegiances or sympathies as those terms are defined by Murray Smith and Noel Carroll. We believe that audience affiliation can be swayed by factors not deemed moral in a story. We'll begin with an example. Jeff Costello, the hero of The Samurai. As with many other films by Melville, it leads us to take the side of a criminal against those who are opposed to his criminal acts, from homicide detectives to police informants. Jeff captures our interest from the outset with his methodical preparations for a hit. First, ingeniously stealing a car, then driving it to a remote garage for clean plates, then handing over payment for a gun. By the time he has killed a man in cold blood in the back office of a club and been swept up in the resulting police dragnet, it is clear that he also has our sympathy. We watch with suspense as he is paraded before one witness after another, hoping that he will get off. But why do we root for Jeff? He is a contract killer. Well, as portrayed by Alain Delon, Jeff is the epitome of savoir-faire. He is good-looking, well-dressed, and cool under pressure. His machinations are ingenious. He arranges an alibi so airtight that it ironically deepens the police inspector's suspicion of him. And he has captured the affections of a married woman who is willing to take the fall for him. This testimonial from another character perhaps moves us as well. In the rhetoric of fiction, Wayne C. Booth allows that any characteristic, mental, physical, or moral, which in real life will make me love or hate other men, will work the same effect in fiction. An attractive face, an enviable facility, and even trustworthy testimony can all be entered on the positive side of the ledger for a character, even if it is true that, in real life, discovering someone is a murderer would provoke abhorrence in many. Indeed, Booth eventually despaired of this, expressing great concern about the potential impact on morals of perspectival techniques such as free and direct discourse and stream of consciousness, which, if used to bring us inside the psyches of immoral characters, could provoke our empathy for them. So there is a lot going on here, but the important point for now is that moral characteristics are only one factor among many that can influence allegiance on Booth's account. More recently, some of the best work on allegiance is due to Noel Carroll and Murray Smith. They have succeeded in distinguishing allegiance from other things that might be meant by identification with a character, but they are also known for defending the thesis that allegiance is exclusively a matter of moral judgment. Mental or physical characteristics that lack moral import are without force. Carroll reasons that in the absence of kinship ties and shared interests with characters, morality of a fairly broad cast, as he puts it, is all that we have as viewers to fall back on in deciding whose side to take in a film story. Meanwhile, Smith takes pains to distinguish allegiance from what he terms alignment, the sort of storytelling where the audience is provided with a character's perspective on the world, and he criticizes Booth for conflating the two since this implies identification with a character. Smith uses the 1980 film Maniac, which aligns us with the perspective of a serial killer, to definitively disprove, as he sees it, the view that alignment can motivate allegiance. If it did, then we would not delight in this killer's dismemberment at the end of the story. To be clear, what we mean by positive allegiance or sympathy for a character is that the audience desires their well-being. We hope the character gets what they need, which, as we will discuss later, may not be the same as what they want. Negative allegiance or antipathy means we desire their comeuppance. What we will henceforth call the moral account is the view that allegiance is the product of moral evaluation. It claims that if we are sympathetic to a character, it is because we have judged them to be deserving of our beneficence from a moral standpoint. But how would Carroll and Smith, limited to moral grounds, explain our allegiance to contract killers like Jeff? His actions in the first part of the film consist of preparing for and carrying out a murder for hire. Yet, as already mentioned, he has our allegiance shortly afterwards in the police station. We feel suspense when we fear that an eyewitness, the piano player who saw him up close, may identify him, and we are relieved when she chooses not to do that. Jeff perhaps earns our allegiance because he is morally preferable to his employer, who tries to cover his tracks by having Jeff killed. But this doesn't happen until after the scene in the police station, and anyway, it wouldn't explain why we want Jeff to prevail over the detective, who is not himself morally dubious, but is only doing his job. It would seem then that Booth is onto something with the idea that our alignment with Jeff's perspective has some sway here. But Carroll and Smith introduced two broad strategies for applying the moral account to cases like this. One is to cast a wide net. According to Carroll, moral assessment is not narrowly confined to actions like murder, but extends to character traits. In a film, of course, character traits are typically conveyed through action, but even a killer may have virtue in their heart of hearts. Carroll also extends the title of moral virtue to mental and physical traits that Booth found merely admirable. His list and Booth's list of factors that influence allegiance are much the same, but Carroll labels all of them moral. Thus, in The Wages of Fear, Carroll suggests that it is the bravado and pragmatism of the petty thieves Mario and Joe that lead us to favor them because these qualities represent what moral virtue there is in the film. It is thus open to Carroll to say something similar about Jeff, treating his ingenuity, for instance, as a moral virtue in his thin sense. Carroll's focus on virtue over action makes another moment in the nightclub loom in importance. Jeff refrains from killing the club's pianist, even though she encounters him in the hallway as he is fleeing the crime scene. Not killing a witness is hardly an act to outweigh a murder, but it does act as a signal of Jeff's moral virtue. He is someone who is able to hold her life dear enough that he is willing to endanger his own life rather than end hers. Smith, while endorsing the same moral account, also acknowledges the effects of iconography on allegiance, including the representation of character by stereotypes of appearance and gesture. And perhaps iconography can influence moral judgment. But the upshot is that Smith can regard even Jeff's almost ethereal good looks as a moral factor in his favor. Again, the factors that Booth, Smith, and Carroll see as influencing allegiance are much the same, but Carroll and Smith designate all such factors as moral. But, as we will argue, the reduction of allegiance to moral judgment means a false identification of the moral order in a story with the order of allegiance. And if that is the case, then Booth's more eclectic grounds for allegiance become more useful. But before we make that argument, we must note a second strategy that Carroll and Smith use to defend their position against potential counterexamples, which is to relativize morality to the values of the story, or as Smith calls it, the co-text. A story can inculcate its own moral universe different from the values the audience may espouse outside the theater. For instance, the title of another of Melville's films, Les Doulos, is meaningless except as criminal slang for police informant, which allows it to bring to the fore the values of the criminal underworld where being a police informant is deserving of death. Variation in story morality means that the same sort of action may receive different moral assessments in different films. Indeed, we find other genres, police procedurals for instance, where we may be allied with rather than against informants. With that covered, we turn now to our critique of the moral account. There is, we submit, a major problem with the thesis that allegiance is meted out on exclusively moral grounds. It implies, in the first place, that allegiance and morality go hand in hand. It implies, in the second place, that we care most about the character that is most moral. And more generally, it implies that we care about characters in the order of our moral appraisals of them. There seems to be no way for Carroll and Smith to evade this conclusion. But if the moral order and the order of allegiance can differ in some cases, then there must be factors outside of morality that are capable of compelling allegiance. There are different ways to show this, but the most straightforward is to point out that the characters whose fates we are most invested in are often of a mixed moral palette, a mixture of good and bad relative to the values projected by the story or co-text. Neither Carroll nor Smith would deny this. Carroll only claims that Mario and Joe are the best of a bad lot, not that they are paragons or that their record is unmixed. However, it is often the case, as we will show, that a morally mixed protagonist is thrown into relief by a supporting character who lacks their flaws and is possibly even a moral paragon in the eyes of the story. This character is the moral center, sometimes called the audience surrogate in screenwriting circles. One of the uses of the moral center is to precisely delineate the axes of morality in the story, either by that character's example or sage advice, so that the audience is in no doubt of what is meant to be good and what is meant to be bad. We can take an example from Billy Wilder's The Apartment. Jack Lemmon's character, C.C. Baxter, is the morally mixed protagonist. His neighbor, the physician, Dr. Dreyfus, is the moral center. While Baxter has good intentions, he is also angling for a promotion at work. And to gain that promotion, he repeatedly allows his boss, Mr. Sheldrake, to use his apartment for an affair with a young woman named Fran. But Baxter knows that Sheldrake is only using Fran and stringing her along. So, when Baxter discovers Fran has taken an overdose of sleeping pills because of how Sheldrake is treating her, and Dr. Dreyfus must step in to save her life, he immediately takes Baxter to task in the aftermath of this.
Why don't you grow up, Baxter? Be a mensch. You know what that means?
I'm not sure.
A mensch, a human being.
In this way, Dr. Dreyfus establishes the gold standard for behavior in the story, a standard that most of us can assent to and which Baxter falls short of. As this demonstrates, the moral center is, as we have said, a supporting role. In the case of Dr. Dreyfus, we are not much interested in his fate. The story gives us no reasons to be. He has no goals of his own beyond helping Baxter save Fran's life and putting Baxter on the right path. But we do care about the less moral protagonist, Baxter. Hence, our allegiances and our sense of morality are out of whack. The most moral character is not the one that holds our strongest affinity. If we want to engage in analysis that distinguishes the moral center from the morally mixed protagonist, then we must reject the moral account of allegiance. We will now argue that we do need to make this distinction if we are to analyze the general structures of the character arc story. In its simplest terms, the character arc story is one where the character in whom we are most invested, let's call them the protagonist, ends up getting what they need in the form of their achievement of moral growth, such that the desire at the heart of our positive allegiance is satisfied. Take Rick in Casablanca. His moral improvement requires that he renounce what he most desires, which is Ilsa. But that desire is thwarted or supplanted by the moral superiority of the act of putting Ilsa and Victor on the plane to Lisbon. For the character arc story to work, the audience must ally with a character, in this case Rick, who is represented as having a mixed moral palette. If there are paragons in the story, then the protagonist cannot be among them, as this would leave no room for moral growth. And the moral growth of the protagonist is going to be the culmination of the story, the satisfaction of our desire that the protagonists get what they need. To return to the apartment, our desire is that Baxter grow up and become a mensch. Now, as we have said, a morally mixed protagonist is not, on its own, a cause to give up the moral account of allegiance. Carroll and Smith have ably defended the account for stories with such protagonists. The problem occurs when the protagonist's flaws are brought out by comparison with a moral center, a character distinct from the protagonist who is comparatively stainless. The moral center is not in principle obligatory to the character arc story, only the flawed protagonist is. But we have found that a moral center is nonetheless often present. Obviously, the creators of character arc stories consider it an advantage to be able to clarify by example the moral and less than moral tendencies of the protagonist. This is especially important when the morality of a story differs from received morality. We may once again be asked to assume the morality of criminals. But that means that the morality that we are to assume must be signaled to us in some way. In The Godfather, this happens when Don Corleone explains to Bonacera that murdering the men who attacked his daughter would not be justice because his daughter is still alive. But in the case of a character arc story, we can't trust the impulses of the protagonist in this way, and so can't use their values to construct a story's morality. In the case of Casablanca, this would lead us into the obvious mistake of making Rick's selfishness out to be self-reliance, not a negative quality, but one held in a positive light by the film. In a character arc story, if we are to convey the positive values of the story through a particular character, then that character must be someone other than the protagonist, the moral center. In Casablanca, the moral center is Victor Laszlo. Victor represents the values of communal resistance. He time and again appeals to Rick to adopt those values, thus bringing Rick's flawed moral stance into high relief. Because of this, when Rick sides with Victor at the end of the story, this overtly marks the positive resolution of Rick's personal conflict of motives. But it is important for our argument to underline that, despite Victor's moral superiority, we do not show greater allegiance to him than to Rick. Indeed, when the desires of the two appear to be in conflict, we hope things will turn out well for Rick, with Victor as an unfortunate casualty. The ending of the film satisfyingly resolves that conflict by providing a superior outcome for Rick. He gets what we believe he needs rather than what he desires. The ending is not satisfying because Victor ends up with Ilsa. The ending is satisfying because Rick does the right thing, which demonstrates that our allegiance has been with Rick and not Victor all along. The character arc story requires our first allegiance to be with the morally flawed character at the center of the story and not the character who serves to exposit the positive component of the story's morality. Now, Carol might say that while Victor is more moral than Rick, that is offset by the fact that we receive more evidence of Rick's virtuous character. After all, we are there when he reproaches a notorious German banker and refuses to let him gamble in his casino. And we are witness to the moment when he rigs the odds at his roulette table in favor of a destitute young couple so that they can win enough money to buy passage to America. But Carol's response would be in vain. If viewers evaluated Rick as morally superior to Victor based on these small and intermittent signals of his virtue, thus ignoring his overall moral vacillation in the face of Victor's pious certitude, then Victor could not embody the morally superior state that Rick achieves by the end of the film. He could not function as the positive moral pole of the story, which he does. After all, it is only when Rick adopts Victor's collectivist cause as his own that Rick achieves his moral apotheosis, and that obviously would not work if we considered Victor to be worse than Rick. Rather than agreeing with Carol that signals of virtue dominate the assessment of action in the moral judgment of a character, we should entertain a more complex picture, one on which the grounds of allegiance are distinguished from those of moral judgment, with perhaps some overlap in some cases. With allegiance distinguished from moral judgment, we could then retain Carroll's observation that some demonstration of virtue is crucial for allegiance, yet deny that small acts of virtue supplant more pious values in the moral calculus of many films. This indeed yields a handy formula for the character arc in particular. Ensure that the protagonist demonstrates virtue in small ways that are consistent with a moral assessment on a larger scheme that rates them as flawed. Meanwhile, use a supporting character, the moral center, to spell out that larger scheme of morality. Once we give up the moral account, we can confine moral to its proper domain. There is no pressing need anymore to see fortitude and bravery, perhaps applied to immoral ends, as particularly moral virtues. They can function instead as amoral traits that tend to command our allegiance, as Booth originally allowed. Moreover, storytellers are then free to construct a story morality that our allegiances are in tune with, are indifferent to, or run counter to, or even construct a universe that is entirely amoral while still maintaining robust allegiances. So, to end where we began, audience affiliation can be swayed by factors not deemed moral in a story. Thank you for your attention.